Good evening and welcome once again to Insight Live, and it's great to be with you as always. And tonight our guest is Philip Yancey, an author who has been my companion, even though I've never known him, throughout many years of my Christian life, and I credit him with basically the positive thinking content in my mind, for lack of a better word. But tonight we're talking about how to get through a crisis, how to cope with a crisis, how we can make it through a crisis.
Thank you, Kurt. Well, it's a very warm welcome from me, Melanie. Insight Live, of course, we are live and interactive, and we are expecting your beautiful contributions through emails or SMSs, and that is on your screen right now, live at revelationtv.com, and then the number is on your screen. So yes, what a privilege to have the quality of Philip Yancey on the program. I mean, I said to Kurt, really, Philip Yancey? I mean, he's like, for us, he's like this mega famous author, and maybe some of you haven't been introduced to him yet. So we have the great privilege of being able to introduce you if it's for the first time, or perhaps you've heard of some of his books. I mean, he's basically, he's written 13 Golden Medallion award-winning books and earned like 2 Christian Books of the Year award. Some of the books that you might remember is What's So Amazing About Grace. That is an incredible book. And the other one is The Jesus I Never Knew. Those are, for us, those are some of the more famous ones that we've seen. And I remember Kurt was running the bookshop at the church that we were attending in Johannesburg, and it was one of his jobs to kind of suggest what to order. And of course, Philip Yancey's
I love this book, The Jesus I Never Knew. I don't know if it was Philip who mentioned it, but there was we speak Spanish, and there was one depiction of Jesus in a movie where all his disciples were Mexican, and then only Jesus spoke Castilian Spanish, So this is a great book. I mean, The Jesus I Never Knew is one of my favorite books of all time.
But we're going to be discussing a different book tonight.
Book. Well, yeah, so many books. We could be here for years.
We could, but actually this is a very interesting topic we're going to be speaking about tonight. Kurt was just telling you this about how to get through a crisis. So, the thing is, we are in kind of very interesting times. I mean, many of you have been watching the television non-stop, seeing, the Queen Elizabeth's funeral, well, not funeral, but Thanksgiving and her coffin there at St. Giles Cathedral, and then we're looking at the government and the new Prime Minister and all these things, and now we have a new king, King Charles the Third, and it just seems and we've got Ukraine and Russia and various other things going in the world, and many of you we've had to encourage you, there will be wars and rumors of wars, but don't let your hearts be troubled. And so I think this is a very interesting topic at this time to be able to think about how do we get through a crisis.
Do you know something? Just in the car last week, I was thinking about that. How do you get through a crisis? And I was thinking about Jesus, the crisis of the cross when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I was kind of just going through my mind, you know what? I discovered Jesus handles crises very similar to us. So for example, when he knew he had to go to the cross, he prayed 3 times, God, I don't want to go through this crisis. Just take it away from me completely. And then, of course, he tells his disciples, not ordering them to pray for him, but I think he said, come on, guys, you can at least spend an hour praying for me. And then an angel came. It said he was deeply disturbed in spirit. Then an angel came and strengthened him. And he's just crying out to his Father. And, not my will, but your will. We understand that. But he was so, isn't it amazing? I mean, he's the most powerful man in the entire universe. But yet at the same time, he dares to be so vulnerable. It's just insane.
But just to comment on that, you were saying that we are similar. We handle crisis similar to Jesus. Well, I would kind of beg to differ a little bit. I think the general population, it's when we're in a crisis that we cry out, God help, God help.
Well, he did. He cried out 3 times.
I'm telling you the difference, though. The difference is that he walked closely with his Father. And a lot of times, we just, our love grows cold. We don't walk with this deep, wonderful, friendship and fellowship with God. But when there's a crisis, it's like, yes, we know who to turn to. But, that's not a bad thing. But obviously, the comfort is that actually we can walk with God every day. Yeah. The comfort is that we don't have to wait for a crisis to have that incredible, wonderful fellowship with the Lord. We have the Holy Spirit, we have His Word, We have fellowship with other believers, and these are all the wonderful gifts that we have, so that we don't have to be living from crisis to crisis.
But Melanie,
to actually get close
we
to God.
we were just joking. If Philip Yancey suddenly did not materialize on television, we could talk for hours. I mean, when our son had leukemia,
we've had
we
enough
could just
crises.
go on and on and on. But Melanie is much better in a crisis than I am.
No, but the problem is when you are good at a crisis, it's what happens after the crisis when it plateaus out. Now that's where I'm not good. I'm very good when it's an immediate crisis. I know what to do.
So,
Draw on the Lord's strength. Yes, so.
we're going to introduce Philip just now, but before we introduce Philip, we're discussing his book because there's so many books and we only have 50 minutes. But he wrote a book called A Companion in Crisis, a modern paraphrase of, say, John Donne's devotions. Now, that's going to turn off a lot of people, especially if you're American, because you don't know who John Donne is. But, just a few weeks ago, I was reading The Guardian, when we were reading the news, and we found out about John Donne. And there's an article in the Guardian, and of course they have to make it sound sensational, so you'll read the article. And it said that he eloped with a girl of 16, had 12 children, but still wrote some of the finest love poetry. In fact, it wasn't just the finest, they said he was the sexiest poet alive. And I read some of his poetry, and it was up there, not as good as Song of Solomon, not that juicy, but it was up there. And I'm just saying, well, how could Philip Yancey, write a book on the sexiest poet alive in British history? And but he was around at a time where the plague was there, and it was even worse than COVID. It took out a third of the population of London. And the funniest thing, Melanie, he became Dean of St. Paul's.
Yes.
And appointed by James I, King James Bible. There you go. And he was a great preacher. He was very theatrical. Thousands of people came to him. He would have got like 1 billion hits on the internet if it had been invented. But he was saying the culture back then was, if they didn't like your sermon, say if you preached, one of you viewers, you preached and you were a bit boring, people would start throwing their shoes at you. And if they really didn't like it, they wouldn't go to the urinal, to the loo. They would pee right there in the aisles, and children would ice skate on people's urine. And I'm just saying, whoa, at least we have more
church behavior.
I think we have more fear of God, at least in St. Paul's today, than back then. So you read about this character and how of John Donne, and you get words like that, like for whom the bell tolls, no man is an island. You've all heard that expression. It comes from him. And he wrote a book that's probably up there as one of the 20th, up there with Shakespeare. In fact, he was a contemporary of Shakespeare. So he's not that well known, even in the UK, but Philip has taken that book, his devotions, that is so difficult to read, and he's put it in a kind of a language that we don't just understand, but we can feel the emotional impact of it. And just before we introduce him, this is like a little kind of a blog before the book. And I really like this. This is why I chose this book. It says, as the world entered a long, dark night, Philip Yancey returned to a nearly 400-year-old manuscript for guidance. Sounds like National Treasure with Nicolas Cage or something. In it, he found a trustworthy companion for living through a global pandemic or any other crisis. As Yancey says, nothing had prepared me for John Donne's raw account of confrontations with God. And that intrigued me, and we're going to introduce Philip to...
Can I just say something, one thing? So one of the things that when I looked up who this John Donne is, and I remember singing, John Donne's body lies molded in the grave. I mean, I don't know whether that's the same John Donne, but anyway. But he got very obsessed when he was ill. He got very obsessed with death. And it's very interesting, many of our viewers, you've written in and you've struggled with, ill health and everything. I really do believe that, tonight is going to be a wonderful night of encouragement to you.
But who helps you? A lot of times people don't encourage you. They just say, I just got to pray more, or I'm going to pray for you. And nobody really kind of guides you. So he had to go back to a 400-year-old manuscript. That sounds brilliantly. But Philip, welcome.
Yes.
And
I
Melanie,
brought
you can
my
welcome
special
him because you can
UK
bear
book.
Look, he's got the beautiful,
Oh.
he's got the British thing going on there. Thank you. A warm welcome
Right.
from all of us on Revelation Television here for viewers. Thank you so much, Philip Yancey, for joining us on Insight Live.
From America.
From America.
From Colorado, is that right?
That's right. I'm in my office here in Colorado. I work at home.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, we just are so grateful that you've taken time to be with us. This is just a huge privilege. And for those of you who don't know Philip Yancey, he is literally a world famous Christian author and speaker. And you can go Google him, look up all his books that he's written. And we are hoping actually for one of these next books to invite him back again. But for tonight, we're going to be looking at the devotions that you have actually written your book about with John Donne. So. Kurt, first question.
So, it sounds like a major Hollywood blockbuster, that introduction, how you went back to a 400-year-old manuscript to find and make sense of what's happening with the pandemic, the suffering. So tell us about your journey.
Well, it actually goes back 45 years or so. I was a young writer. I was working for a magazine, and I kept running into this problem of pain. Anybody who is thoughtful eventually starts to wonder, okay, if God is powerful, if God is loving, why do these bad things happen? Why do children get leukemia? Why do wars happen? Earthquakes, tsunamis, things like that. We all face that, Christians and unbelievers alike. And when I was researching, the book that spoke most to me was this 400-year-old book by John Donne, Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. As you say, 1/3 of London particularly died of the Black Death in a series of waves of the plague that came through. So I would buy copies of this 400-year-old book and give it to my friends and say, this answers a lot of the questions that you have. And then later I'd come up to them and say, did you read that book? Well, a paragraph or two. What? This is a great book. You got to read this book. It's really hard to read. You know, the sentences are very long. I went through and counted. And Kurt, one sentence had 234 words in it.
Oh.
And we're just not used to reading 234 word sentences. And in addition to that, there was this weird science going on. They were still debating in those days, does the earth revolve around the sun or the other way around? And the state-of-the-art treatment for the Black Death in those days was either bleeding or cupping, where they remove blood from your body, or applying pigeons to your mouth and to your feet to draw away the vapors, the evil vapors that were making you sick. So that was the science. Well, when I would give that to my friends, they'd say, this is weird stuff. Why should we trust him about what he says? I say, well, you got to look past the science. They didn't know some of the things we know now, like the germ theory of disease. But his wrestling with God, one man alone wrestling with God, why is this happening? As you say, John Donne had kind of a spotted past, but he became converted. He studied, he became a dean. He became the vicar of the largest church in Great Britain. And then in the midst of the plague, when he finally had a chance to bring comfort and insight to his people, he got sick. And everybody, including Donne, including his doctors, thought he had the plague. Turned out he didn't. He had something probably like a typhoid fever. But he lay in bed for several weeks, about 6 weeks, trying to figure out, what should I do in the midst of this crisis like this? What can I offer other people? And if this indeed is my deathbed, what can I conclude my life with? And actually, that's not so different than what a lot of us go through. We go through a crisis, whether it's someone in the family with health, or a global pandemic, or a war like the people in Ukraine. You know, they're asking these questions every night as bombs fall. Britain knows what that's like. You went through that in the Blitz in World War II. When our pandemic, the coronavirus, happened, a lot of new books came out on God and the pandemic and things like that. Brand new books that were written in just a few weeks. And I thought, why don't we go back to someone who's been around for a while, someone who has stood the test of time? So I took this 400-year-old manuscript and redid it. You've seen modern versions of the Bible, Kurt, I'm sure, like the Message that takes the old King James and puts it in modern language. That's what I tried to do with John Donne. And I got to tell you, it's a lot easier to start with one of the great masters of the English language like John Donne than with a blank computer screen or a blank piece of paper. I had a delightful time reading it, and in the process was amazed again at just the knowledge and the wisdom that John Donne had at a true moment of crisis in British history.
So what, like when you were recommending this book to your friends and you were excited about it, what were, say, the three things that hit you the most, that were a unique offering to the Christian community?
When something bad happens, we automatically kind of assume that God is trying to get through to us, give us a message. Now, John Calvin was brand new in John Donne's day, and Calvin was saying to people, everything that happens is a direct message from God. So if you fall and break your arm, that's God speaking to you. If you get leukemia, that's God speaking to you. And John Donne, who got sick, started wondering, okay, what is God saying to me? As you say, he had kind of a randy past before his conversion. And he wondered, at one point he said, has God nailed me to my bed? He used the bed for immoral acts. Now is God punishing him by nailing him literally to his bed? So that's one thing that happens. We ask ourselves, even insurance companies, when a fire happens, an earthquake happens, it's called an act of God. An act of God. When we don't know who else to blame, we blame God. So one question we all have is, did God send this? Is this a direct message from God? John Donne struggles with that. Another message is the message of fear. I guess that's one of the things that strikes me most about John Donne's book. He says, I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what I see in the doctors' faces, the fear that I see in their eyes. That's fear of my body. I'm afraid of death. I'm afraid of judgment. I'm afraid. And then finally he says, actually, I could either be afraid of all of these little things, or I could fear in the proper way the God that I trust. If I can trust God, if I can fear God in the right way, then I don't have to fear all these other things. So instead of being anxious about these things, I need to work on my relationship with God. I need to use this time as a time to show my trust in God, because God, I believe, he would say, I believe God is in control. And I believe not only that God is a God of grace and mercy and upholds me in the same way he did so many of the people who wrote the Psalms of trust in God who upholds the universe.
It's really interesting. We interviewed a dentist who is very, like, in his 30s, top of his profession, and very bright future ahead of him. And then he got some disease. I forget what it was. And eventually it reduced him. He was completely paralyzed. He could move his thumb, and then he could just mumble some words. But he said to us, that the Old Testament, at least, talks more about God's sustaining power than healing. And it's really interesting, because you go to a bookstore, you don't want to see a book title "Sustained by God." You want to see "Healed," "Delivered," more dramatic titles. And I think somebody reviewed your book or something, and I just got the scripture out of it. And it says, "The Lord sustained them on their sick bed and restores them from their bed of illness." And I was reminded of Handel, funny enough, in London. He was kind of like the Simon Cowell, brought in beautiful girls and operettas and so on, and then he was falling out of favor, and then he got sick, and he was kind of on his kind of "for whom the bell tolls" deathbed as well, until a minister brought some verses from Isaiah, and then he composed Handel's Messiah. But he did it in 21 days, and even a musicologist at Yale University said, I can't even copy this in 21 days. And I kind of see that I think we miss out on God's sustaining power by just saying, oh, I'm not healed, I'm not healed. And maybe there's something like it says, for example, he gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. And what's your comment on that kind of being sustained?
Sure. The very first book I wrote was a book with the title "Where is God When It Hurts?" And that was almost 50 years ago
That's
now.
Right. I remember that one.
And I've written on the topic again and again. Not just a few years ago, I wrote a book called "The Question That Never Goes Away," the question of why these things happen. And I've interviewed a lot of people. I've been to places where disasters have happened, the tsunami in Japan and Sarajevo in the war, and school shootings here in the United States. And I came away with a slogan that became almost like a mantra to me, and it goes like this: pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed. Because
Wow.
I've been around people like, think of Johnny Erickson Tata. Many of
Yeah.
you viewers know that story. This young woman who wanted to be an Olympic athlete and live the good life, you know, have a home in the suburbs and a van and children and all that and horses in the backyard. And then she dived into the Chesapeake Bay, hit a rock, and was paralyzed for the rest of her life.
From her
And I
neck
interviewed
down.
her
Yeah.
actually as a young child, as a young journalist. I interviewed her, and I remember being in her living room, and she started to cry, and you know, I didn't know what to do. Men aren't very good at that. And she said, "Philip, I'm so sorry, but could you go in the other room and get me a Kleenex and wipe my tears?"
Wow.
So I did that. I did that. And then she said, "I'm so ashamed. I can't do anything on my own. I can't use the bathroom on my own. I can't walk on my own. I can't even cry without help. I can't imagine going through life like this." Well, just a few years ago, we're about the same age. Just a few years ago, Johnny turned 70.
Wow.
She's had a tough life.
Yeah.
Besides being a paraplegic, she has had breast cancer. She had a bad case of COVID. She's just had a lot of struggles. And yet she has been a prophetess to the church around the world, and how we should deal with disabled people. And I heard her say on her 70th birthday, she said, "The day that I dived into the Chesapeake Bay was the best day of my life." And I thought back to that scene where she
Pain
said, "I don't know
redeemed.
how I can face the rest of my life." Pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed. We don't have the promise that we'll never run into problems. I believe about the same percentage of Christians got COVID as non-Christians got COVID. I think about the same percentages of Christians wear eyeglasses and go bald as non-Christians. You don't get an exemption when you follow Jesus. And I'm sure of this one, exactly the same percentage of Christians die as non-Christians. 100%. You know? So if you're staking everything, if you're staking your faith on not having any problems, you're going to lose. It's just not a good gamble. We don't get the exemption. When God came to earth in the person of Jesus, Jesus didn't get that exemption. He went through the same kind of pain and testing and travail that we do. But what do we learn from that? We learn that God can take the worst things and somehow create good out of them. So, for example, the worst thing, you could make the case, the worst thing that has ever happened in human history was when a perfect person, the Son of God, came to earth and was brutally murdered. That's the worst thing that could happen. That's a day that we call not tragic Friday, Black Friday, Dark Friday, but Good Friday.
Yeah.
Because God took that and out of it wove the salvation of the world and
But-
showed us
Yeah.
there is something on the other side. There's
But isn't
Easter on
it
the other
interesting that Scripture records just his inner being when he went through that pain? And it was so human. Like I was saying to Melanie, like, can't you pray with me for at least an hour? I'm really
Right.
going through some suffering. And Angel had the strength in him, and he prayed that it would be removed. And I find that fascinating that Scripture reveals that vulnerability. And
Yes.
I don't think there's much. I find it'd be very interesting to know how the Psalms sync up with John Donne. And it would be very interesting to know. I don't think there's a lot of honesty these days in Christian circles. I mean, even Job's friends were with him and cried for 7 days. I've never cried for a friend of mine for 7 days. You know, I just, do they sync with the Psalms? Like when you read John Donne, do you appreciate the Psalms more?
You're talking about like modern praise songs, or the
No,
Psalms
I'm
in
talking
No, the
about,
Psalms.
I'm talking the
Yeah.
book of Psalms.
David
Psalms.
Psalms.
And how it processes through, like Psalm 73, for example, you know, how it processes people who are on their deathbeds or sick, or, like in Psalm 80 something, it says, "My only friend is the grave, is death."
Right.
And you see this brutal honesty, this confrontation with God that I don't really see in modern Christian literature or modern songs.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Time magazine, when the coronavirus first hit and the whole world was afraid, we didn't know what was going to happen. Would millions of people die again, like did in the Spanish influenza epidemic? But they asked a theologian, it was your own N.T. Wright, and said, what word can you give to the American public? And he said, well, I guess the word I would have first is lament. It's okay to lament. It's okay to cry out to God and say, God, we're hurting here. We don't like what's going on. What good can come out of this? And he said, at least half, some people say as many as 2/3 of the Psalms in the book of Psalms are Psalms of lament. And it's as if God knew. I respect a God who not only gives us the freedom to cry out and question the way he's running the world, but gives us the words to use. They're right there. A lot of people think Psalms, oh, let's see, I'll go to the hospital, I've got a friend there, and I'll read them from the Psalms. Well, you better be very careful which ones you choose.
That's very true, because they might go against modern theology.
Oh, Lord, are you even there? I can't believe you. You never respond when I cry out to you. You hear these laments over and over. And that's what we feel inescapably when we go through these hard times. And that's what John Donne captured so beautifully, because he was one of the great writers of all time in your country, in any country, frankly. And so he was able to express that existential pain, that cry, that lament, and the wrestling that God seems to encourage. And you referred to the way Jesus faced pain. We would think, we have this kind of idealized view of Jesus. We would think that he would say something like, okay, disciples, gather around. I'm going to show you how to go through hard times with an overcoming spirit. Are you watching? Are you watching? But he didn't. He felt the same fear, the same sense of abandonment. My God, why have you abandoned me? The same feelings that we have when we go through hard times. And if Jesus did that, and if the Psalms say that, then we're okay in following along and just telling God exactly how we feel. And that's what Donne captures so beautifully, that raw, honest vulnerability, and sometimes anger and sometimes fear, but taking God seriously, bringing God into the middle of whatever I'm going through, and asking God to be the companion that can help bring you through the other side.
We're going to take a little deviation to our beautiful viewers, Philip, and perhaps we'll see what they've got to say. Well, Philip Yancey, wow, says Eve. She says, good evening, Revelation TV. Wow, Philip Yancey, what a treat. A friend brought me his book, What's So Amazing About Grace. I read it, but perhaps I'd best read it again. Well done, Eve. By the way, Melanie, and then thank you for the compliment. That's really lovely. Blessings, and that's from Eve. So, yes, so I think she's going to read the book again, but maybe she's going to buy the new book. And what is it called? It is called
A Companion in Crisis.
There you go, A Companion in Crisis. We've got Santander. Santander, thanks for writing in. Greetings to you both. What I have found from my walk with God is that if you want to experience His favor and goodness in the greater way, then it comes from a place of humility, being humble before God and not relying on others or yourself allows God's provision to flow abundantly in your life. It also shows that you are dependent on Him and Him alone. I am reminded of the scripture which says that when I'm weak, then I am strong. And unfortunately, it does take us to be in this position sometimes before we look up and cry out to the Lord. Blessings, Santander. Thank you. Beautifully written, great sentiment. I think it definitely encompasses what we're talking about as well, and what we were speaking about earlier.
Let's slow down on this one. He says, when I'm weak, I'm strong. And look, we're going to all experience pain, so we might as well befriend it, like the Apostle Paul did in a weird way. How can we kind of live out that verse? When I glory in weakness and insults and injuries. What does he mean by that? And how would that fit into John Donne's book?
Sure, that's a great question. And the Apostle Paul, we don't know exactly what the problem was, but he had apparently a physical problem that he called a thorn in the flesh. And people have speculated over the years, is it a problem with his eyes? Is it depression? He doesn't spell it out. But he said he cried out and asked God 3 different times to take it away. And I'm sure, the Apostle Paul was a great missionary, was having an enormous impact in that part of the world. And I'm sure he cried out and said to God, come on, God, just take this away and I can be much more useful to you. Yeah. And that's when he concluded, it's actually in my weakness that you are made strong. And if I go around thinking, look at me, I've got it down now, just follow my path, then I'm going to mislead people. I need to depend on you. I need to look to you for my strength. And actually, in the same way that Jesus made himself vulnerable in front of his disciples, the Apostle Paul is making himself vulnerable in front of us. And I mentioned earlier that pain redeemed is the pattern that we see in the Bible. And in Romans 8, Paul goes over a little bit of a biography of his life, just refers to some of the things he went through. And he says, in all of these things, God worked for my good. And some of the things he mentioned are things that most of us will never experience: shipwreck and snake bite and prison and torture. And then at the end of that chapter, he concludes so triumphantly. He says that God can work in all of these things. And in fact, God will use them for our good. There's that verse, Romans 8:28. Yeah. A lot of people who read that think it says, for those who love God, only good things will happen. Well, it doesn't say that at all.
Yeah.
It says for those who love God, but no matter what happens, God can somehow.
Isn't it amazing, towards the end of Romans 8 that you're talking about, it says that we're more than conquerors through him who loves us.
Yeah.
And if I was like a victorious preacher and I say, you're more than a conqueror, but isn't it amazing? We're only conquerors because of love.
Because of love.
And think about it. When I first fell in love with Melanie, I was more than a conqueror. When I first fell in love with her, somebody ran me over with a car, and I still got up with a smile on my face.
My goodness.
Because I just I felt loved, and I just saw that verse. It's amazing. Because I just preached on that whole thing that God works in and through all things, and even the good things. But many times we assume that he works through the bad things only. Yeah. And we forget.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God. And he spells out, whether it's the universe, with space, time, death, life, nothing can separate us from the love of God.
So how has John done on that concept of love? I mean, he's got a guy like St. Augustine, had his wild life and so on. And then he actually, when he received his holy orders from James I, I heard that he repented and he burnt some of his poetry.
Oh, he did.
Yeah,
he did.
So I don't know. But how does love, that concept of love that we're talking about right now, figure into his writings?
Well, you referred earlier to some of the famous sayings from John Donne, and there's one of the devotions that includes "No man is an island," and "Sin not for whom the bell tolls for thee," those kind of phrases. And what's happening there, here he is in the parsonage, just down from St. Paul's, where he's the vicar, but he's in bed, can't get out of bed. Doctors have confined him there. And he hears every day, just about, he hears a bell tolling. And sometimes they would toll this person is near death. Sometimes they would toll that this person has now departed and they're sending him off, his soul, to heaven. And he, through an open window, hears that tolling bell and first thinks, "Oh no, am I next? Do the doctors know something they haven't told me? Is that bell tolling for me?" and then as he thinks about it, he realizes, I've been so self-absorbed, and sickness does that, doesn't it? We can only think about getting through one day at a time. We don't think about how's my wife doing, wonder how the kids are. We think about how am I?
Yeah.
And that's what John Donne was experiencing. And then he realized how selfish, in a sense, he was. And he started thinking, that could be my neighbor. That could be somebody I know. In fact, I'm probably their pastor. And I should be thinking about them. And in his case, he summoned up the compassion that he had been missing. Pain does kind of isolate you. And he said, no, pain should unite us. Because if that person has died, Europe is the less. Every person who dies takes something away from this town, this country, this world. No man is an island. We're all connected together. That's where that poem comes from. Beautiful poem.
That's beautiful. Can we just go on to Kevin? Kevin has written in. Thank you so much, Kevin, for writing.
Hi, Kevin.
Really pleased that you're watching. Also, Dylan, want to blow you a kiss. Lovely that you're watching too. But Kevin's written in, hi, great program tonight. Been walking with Jesus 20 years and it's been so painful at times. Took me 7 years to learn to sleep as I never slept properly in the old life. Addiction did that. Strips everything away. I learnt new ways by Jesus' power. At best painful, as there was much needed to be taken out of me from the past. Jesus never let me down and brought me through. Then I learnt the truth of Jesus in my walk. Very powerful and freedom out of painful walk. So blessed to have my past revealed and delivered by Jesus into deep truth. Such a joy. Thanks, Jesus, Kev. Kevin, thank you. You always write very honest, vulnerable emails. And just wondering whether you have a comment there for Kevin, Philip?
Yes, I do. And it actually ties in exactly with what I was saying about John Donne, realizing we're not alone. We're in this together. And there's a very clear scripture about what we should be doing as Christians to others in the body. And Kevin has hinted at that. In the scriptures in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it says, it calls God the God of all comfort and the Father of compassion. You know, a lot of people think of God as the one causing pain and punishing us, but no, God is the God of all comfort, the Father of compassion. And it says, take the comfort you have already received from God, such as what Kevin describes, and spread it abroad to people who don't have it. And that's what we're called to do. And I've got to say, in my own country, I don't think the church did a very good job during the pandemic. We in ways added to the division, to the polarization. And our job is clearly to represent that God of all comfort, the Father of compassion. And if we're not getting that message across, then we're missing an opportunity to minister.
But you just said something that's very profound. You said that John Donne, in his pain, suddenly realized that, hey, I have to start thinking about other people. It might be my neighbor. No, we didn't do a good job in the States. It was all about governments taking away our rights, everything. It's all about our church. We don't want to it was just like a kind of a me thing. But maybe some of us don't have our breakthroughs with our battle and pain because we don't comfort other people with the comfort that we've received. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, when you were talking about it, I know a lot of people, the conversation is about their pain, but when we were in the leukemia ward, and children were dying, etc., we were probably in the hospital, 380 nights with our son. He's well, and he works here now. He's been here for 7 years, so it's a good story, but he almost died 5 times. But the pain really united us with other parents and him with a friend of his that's just come back. And you start thinking, but Melanie and I saw other people that even though their kids were dying, they were thinking about other people. And there was a level of joy in them that was so extraordinary. But now that you mention it, I think that's what they had in common, that they would think about other people.
Yeah, well, Chandra Kumar has just written in, and he's quoting Matthew 5:4, and he says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So Chandra Kumar, thank you for that. It's interesting how this conversation is going.
Yeah, this is great.
And we're talking about, that when you mourn, you shall be comforted. Any comments on that, Philip?
Well, you in the UK who are watching are in the midst of mourning right now. And of course, we know what that's like in America. I remember very clearly when John Kennedy was assassinated, when Martin Luther King died, and September 11, we just had a few days ago. And mourning doesn't always, but can bring us together. It unites us. And boy, after September 11, church attendance went up by more than 1/3 for a short period of time. But people wanted to be around comforters. And where did they go? Well, they went to the church. And we should continue to be that beacon of compassion. Now, I heard the other day, I get to travel around the world, and I heard the other day that 50% of all the health care in sub-Saharan Africa is provided by mission agencies.
Wow.
And there are a lot of people in the continent of Africa, and you can speak to this because you've lived there. There are a lot of people who couldn't really tell you the Nicene Creed, couldn't explain the Trinity. But if you ask them, what is a Christian? Well, I'm not sure, but there's a little van with the Red Cross painted on the side, and once a week they come through town and they heal my diseases and they fix my broken bones. And that's not the whole gospel, but it's a good start. And we can, from there, introduce them to the great physician who's the God of all comfort, the Father of compassion.
Wow. Beautiful.
So, Cynthia, thank you. You've written in and to Insight Live, and you say, I think at times, whenever we're going through, we need to literally go into that closet and prayerfully cry out to God, bring all our hurts and concerns to Him. We need to be fervent in prayer. There's never been a time such as this through what we are all experiencing at this time. Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, it's these times are very interesting. But what I remind people of is that, you know, nothing is new under the sun. Generations have gone through so many different things, and because we have social media and we can see everything that's happening, if there's an earthquake here or a war here or whatever the case is, we see people suffering, we see people's opinions. But, you know, there were times that were much worse than these times when we think about the luxuries that we have in modern day, and that we actually have choices. Some, you know, in so many places, people don't have choices.
Penicillin and antibiotics have kept most of us alive.
Well, slavery and all those kind of things. I mean, I know we have trafficking and things like that, but there's an awareness. I think when we think about the Judeo-Christian, morality and ethics, it's amazing how much people live by that, whether they believe in God or not. So, Philip, I'm sure you have plenty to say on this.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I just have finished reading a book about London during the Blitz. And I think of the impact of September 11 on my country, but night after night in London, 1,000, 1,500, 1,700 people were being killed by this relentless bombing that went on for months and months. And life without anesthetics, you know, life when there were no eyeglasses, life when at a certain point your teeth had to be pulled and there was no painkiller for the pulling of teeth. We actually have it pretty good. You go back and read John Donne's days, and you read of the poor treatment they had for something like bubonic plague. Doctors who used the state-of-the-art medicine of the day made things worse, not better.
Yeah.
And actually contributed to the patient's death in many cases. So we should be grateful. As we also cry out to God, let us also give thanks that, as you say, we do have choices, and modern medicine can be a part. It is exploring what God has given us here on earth, our minds, the abilities in pharmacy and all that, and it can be a part of God's healing plan for the planet.
Isn't that amazing, that verse? I mean, N.T. Wright was the one that brought it to my attention. He said in heaven, well, the New Jerusalem on earth, he says there seems to be a process of healing where it talks about the leaves of the trees, you know, and the waterway going out from Jerusalem are for the healing of the nations. And, you know, I come from a therapist, psychiatry, psychologist background, and that Greek word is actually therapy. That's where we get therapy from. So there's going to be therapy in heaven. And it just really tickled me, you know, when I found that out. And, you know, here we are, and it's talking about the nations, and are they saved? But they're in the new heaven and the new earth. See, so N.T. Wright brings up these questions, but there's that process of healing that continues even on heaven, on earth. Isn't that amazing?
That's a great insight. Yeah, I haven't heard that.
N.T. Wright, he brought it to my attention. Good God.
So Chandra Kumar has written in again, Philip, and he's kind of addressing you to this. Hi, Philip Yancey. There are innocent people in churches who hold grudges against each other, which they haven't cleared with the Lord. Which is eating away their lives and making their bodies sick. It is sin, which they have to confess. Otherwise, the darkness, darkness and the light of God will distinguish from their body. Do you agree, Philip?
So the general gist is people are holding grudges against each other.
Yeah, and it's bringing
destroying
darkness and snuffing out the light of God. So he's asking whether you agree with this.
Well, he started out by saying there are innocent people. There are also guilty people in church who are bearing these grudges. And the same year I released this book, A Companion in Crisis, I wrote a memoir called Where the Light Fell. And I tell the story of the church I grew up in, which is, I think God said, okay, you're going to write about the church. I want to show you the worst of the church. And then later I'll show you the best. But you got to live through the worst first to know what we're doing wrong. And in my own family, there were only 3 of us. My father died when I was a year old. So I had a mother and a brother 2 years older. And they crossed in teenage days, and they didn't speak to one another for 51 years. 51 years. And then just last year, for the first time, I got them on a 3-way phone conversation. And it was amazing to me that during that time, I'd spent time with my mother. I'd spent time with my brother, who live across the country, California and Georgia. And they were both being controlled by the other, even though they had no contact with each other. And that can happen. You bear these grudges, and unless somebody takes that risk and says, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And it is a risk, and these are the hardest words we ever say. My brother finally, after all these years, wrote her a card with 3 words on it: I forgive you.
Wow.
And people had told him, you're the only one who can release that chain around your neck. And the only way you can do it is to take that step of forgiveness. So in that sense, it's right. I don't know how it works out in terms of the physical ailments that the writer is talking about, but I've seen how it affected each one of them, certainly mentally and emotionally, and just really controlling their life in a negative way.
Yeah.
Wow. So, we're talking about, people who are sick, people who are going through crisis, through people who have a lot of difficulties. But I think some of the times, when Kurt and I have been speaking and interacting with our viewers, we've often looked at, let's look at our own culpability. What are we bringing on ourselves? And I think, Chandra Kumar, you also brought that, I think it was yours at Santander, about unforgiveness. So, sometimes we do bring sickness upon ourselves. We bring these things, like you were saying about your brother. What I'd like is for you to just encourage somebody who's in that situation right now. Perhaps you can speak directly to them, Philip. Either they've got unforgiveness, or either they've actually got attitudes and thoughts that actually have brought illness upon themselves. Wrong beliefs and not really walking with the Lord in a way that brings life and light. Perhaps you could address that and just maybe even pray for some of our viewers that might be struggling with that, because not everybody writes in.
Right. Forgiveness is so important. Just this morning, actually, I was reading a passage on forgiveness by Desmond Tutu, Bishop Desmond Tutu. And to my surprise, he said, the reason I've learned forgiveness is that I realize that I'm as culpable as someone else. So that if I were in the same position as the white apartheid people who were in control of my country for a while, I probably would have been just as arrogant and maybe even cruel as they were. And unless I realize that, it's going to be very hard for me to forgive them. But part of it is just coming before God and realizing I'm not so different. I've got my own problems. And if I were in their situation, I may be just as bad as they are. That's a remarkable statement coming from Bishop Tutu, considering what he lived through and everything he saw. But I think there's a sweet little verse in Romans 12 that says, vengeance is God's. And life is unfair. People hurt us. What can we do? And Paul says, we turn it over to God and let God be the judge. I'm not a very good judge. Jesus said, you worry about the speck in somebody else's eye. What about the log in your eye? We're not very good at justice makers. But as followers of Jesus, we trust that God is a good justice maker. And Jesus was so clear. He said, he went so far as to say, love your enemies. And the disciples said, love your enemies? That doesn't make any sense at all. That's crazy talk. Why would anybody do that? And Jesus said, well, God the Father causes the rain to fall and the sun to shine on the just and the unjust alike. And the only way that people are going to know what God is like, that God of grace and forgiveness and mercy, is if you show them by how you treat other people.
Wow.
And that's what we're called to do. And then trust the justice part with God, not myself. None of us would be impartial in our justice. We would all be biased. We trust that God is just and it will all work out. God will see that it works out. So I just have to trust God and pray. And by forgiving, as in the case of my brother and mother, release that built up toxin. Unless you let it out, it just gets worse and worse over decades. I saw that between the two of them. And so I do pray for some of the people who are listening. I don't know if you've been touched. You know, families are strange. Some of the most difficult kind of forgiveness is to come up with families. So God, I just ask that anyone who is struggling, who has a grudge or hasn't spoken to someone, I know what that's like. It's been true in my own little family, and it just rips us apart. I pray that you would give the courage and the trust. We can't do that in our own strength, but we can turn to you, God, and we can say, give me the courage that I don't have to make that step and say these difficult words. I'm sorry. I'm sure I had a part in it as well. Will you forgive me? And toss it back to the other party, but release it from yourself so that you no longer have to carry around that burden, that poison that can work inside you.
Yeah. So we have 3 minutes
Thank
left.
you.
I wish we had 3 hours left.
Yes.
But we have. I want to get him on the program again for his memoirs.
Oh, yes,
because
definitely,
that's really
definitely.
exciting. Okay. But how can we look? I mean, I'm sure you can get hold of your book in many ways. But what is your preferred way for primarily British people to get hold of your book? A companion in crisis.
Well, I still like the old-fashioned bookstores myself, because you can browse and kind of
so do
sample
I.
it before you buy it. So I know a lot of them are gone, especially in the UK, but if there's a Christian bookshop near you, I would start there. If not, of course, there's Amazon and any number of online sellers.
Probably Eden that we have in the UK. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And the two books are A Companion in Crisis, and that's John Donne redone.
John Donne redone.
And that's good for people who are suffering and wanting to just kind of understand that, what we've been talking about
Or
tonight.
going through any
Right.
crisis.
Yeah,
Any
any
crisis.
crisis, yes.
Yeah.
Right. And then Where the Light Fell is the memoir that tells my own family stories. And when I look back, when I wrote it, I realized that so many of my books, no matter what I start writing about, I end up talking about one of two things: grace and pain.
Wow.
Pain and suffering. Pain and suffering because I experienced a lot, and that's what I spell out in my family story. My father died of polio when I was a year old.
Oh, gosh.
And there's a whole story behind that. And then grace, because I grew up in a church, Kurt, as you know, that didn't have much grace.
Okay, we have like 1 minute left, but
Right.
with your permission, I'll email you, and maybe in like a couple of months from now, if you can come back on, and we can
That'd be great.
We would absolutely
We
love
would
it.
love you to do
Because
that.
his
That would be
story
really amazing.
is amazing.
So I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of all our viewers. Philip Yancey, what a privilege to have you on the program with us. Thank you so much on behalf of all the viewers as well. And we just bless your books to really be widely spread and read, and many more books to come. So God bless you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, bye, Philip.
It was a pleasure, Melanie.
Yeah, wow.
Oh, beautiful.
For
Absolutely beautiful.
me, this is like he's always been a companion there with me in his books, guiding me through tough times and so on. Just like John Donne was a companion to him. So
Yes,
it's just
yes,
amazing. Thank
yeah.
you, Philip. Thank you so
So
much.
Cynthia, thank you for writing in. And I was just quickly, reading through, how you had a lot of difficulties with the sirens and everything. I haven't got time to read the whole thing, but thank you so much for writing in. And so many of our viewers have incredible experiences. Anyway, we want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. God bless you. Go and get that book, Kurt.
And we will see you next week, as usual, on Insight Live. God bless you. We love you, and thanks for your participation.